Good morning. It is Thursday, the 12th of January, 2023. And today we continue in the book of the prophet Isaiah, chapter 41, reading verses 17 to the end, which is verse 29. And I want to just pause a little and say that when one reads scripture, especially here in the Old Testament, it's quite clear that it's the prophet Isaiah speaking, but he is speaking the words of God. But the way that God or Isaiah expresses himself is a little different to the way that you and I might express ourselves now. We tend to be a lot more specific. We will use the person's name. We do not talk in innuendo. We do not allude to things. We are a lot more specific. It's particularly the cultural way in which we operate. But in the Old Testament, it was different. People would speak in this way. There is also, as a second aspect, an element in which these prophetic words are often put in a way that is more poetic. They are not as blunt as we might have been if we were to have phrased this ourselves in the modern era. And so when one reads scripture, one needs to bear in mind that the culture was different and the way that they expressed themselves was different, but that they also used a lot more of poetic allusion to express their teaching and to express the prophetic outcome of what it was that they were speaking about. And so an example is that in this section that I alluded to, as Isaiah 41, 17 to 29, God again is speaking and he is calling to account the so-called gods of Babylon and the nations around them. He does so almost as if it's a court appearance. He says, "Come now, account for what you have done." But he speaks about their inability to have predicted the future, whereas he says, "I have long since predicted the future. I had told Israel that somebody would come from the north." Here is this poetic allusion that I was referencing earlier. Somebody, no name given, would come from the north and, although it's not stated, but would therefore defeat Babylon. Now, who is this person and why from the north? We know that the person who defeated Babylon was Cyrus, but he comes from the east. So how do we go from the east to the north? Well, if we understand some of the history, and this is where the poetic allusion comes into its own, because in just one short sentence, somebody will come from the north. An entire history is laid out, and one has to understand that history. One has to interpret these words into the context in which they were given so as to glean from it the full extent of the truth. And that use of poetry, and we would do it even today in poetry. We don't write our newspaper articles poetically, but when we talk in poetry, we can, in one sentence, one line of words, we can actually say a whole lot. And so what happened was that Cyrus grew up and came originally from a place that was to the east of Babylon. And when he began his campaigns, he started moving north, but he skirted Babylon and he moved around it and went further north, and then suddenly turned and came back to Babylon and defeated them, catching them completely unawares. That's the whole story of what's in the Old Testament is listed as King Nebuchadnezzar. He, interestingly, in the annals of the kings of that time, there is no King Nebuchadnezzar, but there is a son of a king, Nebuchadnezzar, a son of a king called Nebuchadnezzar, who, interestingly, was put in charge of the kingdom temporarily while his dad, the real king, went off somewhere on a state visit or a hunting trip, we don't know. And while the son was in power, as sons are wont to do with all this power and authority and resources, he threw a mega party. And it was in that party that this finger appears on the wall and writes those words. And the following morning, it's all over. Babylon has fallen. Cyrus attacked from the north, even though he was from the east. And God is saying, in effect, I mean, that's just a little bit of the history, but explaining why sometimes the poetic manner in which the Old Testament and these prophecies are written, we need to understand them to get the real gleaning from this. But what God is saying is that all of you idols or all of you so-called gods, how come you never predicted this? How come you yourselves were unaware of what was about to happen? And yet you call yourself a god, and you want people to worship you, and you want to indicate that you control their lives. Obviously, they aren't real gods. They're just wooden idols, because God goes on to say, you actually are nothing but idols. God is speaking to the people, saying the gods that you have anointed and appointed are useless, worthless, actually detestable, because they cost you your life, because they could not predict the future. And yet I knew all of this well in advance. So what do we learn from that? Well, a couple of things. Firstly, apart from the way that God speaks and communicates to us, sometimes in a way that is not quite as blunt or specific as we would want, we need to understand and interpret what God is saying. And don't expect God to be just like us. He is God. We must become more like him. Then God can also do things in a way that is quite incredible. We would think that the description of Cyrus would only and always be as being from the east. Here it is from the north, but that speaks to, poetically, the manner in which Cyrus had conducted his campaign. Elsewhere in Scripture, he is referred to as the one who comes from the east. And so when God works in our life, he might work in a way that catches us completely by surprise. We might think God will use the church or some godly person to bring about some form of redemption. It may well be that God uses somebody else who's not even a Christian. Cyrus wasn't a Christian. He acknowledged that God in this particular context was sovereign, and so he referenced God, the Jewish God, the Lord, in his decrees, but he himself never became a follower of God. And it might be that God will use whoever and whatever, whenever and however, whatever, anything, to bring about salvation. Let us be faithful and trusting in God, and let us be open and let God work, rather than determining and telling God quite how to work. So have faith and let God be God, and let us accept that God could do anything. So look above and below and to the left and the right and the front and the back, because God could come from any direction to bring salvation and help to you. But always let us have faith in God and turn to him. Folks, we'll chat again tomorrow. God bless.